For decades, North Wales was the hunting ground for a mysterious, sadistic attacker.
Men were getting attacked by a tall man who wore black leather clothing.
And in the 1990s, the man in black graduated to serial killing.
Killed without any mercy at all.
Stabbed 9 times?
Hiding behind a respectable facade, the killer led a sordid double life.
I cannot believe that this turned into the House of Horrors.
There was whips, there was rubber truncheons.
Blood splatters on the walls and on the ceilings.
But what made this monster? In the mid-1990s, the popular stretch of coast from Kinmel Bay to Pensarn in North Wales attracted thousands of holidaymakers looking for their annual dose of relaxation in the summer sun.
When the holiday season started, you get the people coming from Manchester, Stoke, Liverpool. So a right mixed bag of people come and spend their holidays in the caravans.
It's very much a tourism area. There's no major industry in the area. To put it quite simply, it closes down in winter.
When the caravan sites close down, the area becomes more of a village community and gets more of a village feel to it. It's reasonably crime-free.
You could get the burglaries, you get the drunk drivers, but it was just the ticking over crime.
On December the 17th, 1995, 35-year-old father of 2, Anthony Davis, had been looking forward to Christmas, but had put his festive preparations on hold to help out an aunt in need.
She wanted to go up to the graveside, you know, to see where her husband was buried, take some flowers up there. And unfortunately, on the way out to the cemetery, she's fallen and she broke a leg.
Anthony and his wife Sheila would stay with their aunt at the local hospital all day. It was a typical act of kindness from the warm-hearted family man.
You'd like him straight away. He's the type of guy that you can sort of get to know within seconds. You wouldn't get a word in edgeways with him half the time.
He was really funny. He was absolutely full of life and he was always playing with us. He was absolutely brilliant. He was like an older brother. That's how close we all were, really.
Having taken his aunt back home that afternoon, Anthony wanted to check up on her once more.
And that night, he said he was going back to see her, just to pay her a late call. And it was when he didn't return home from seeing her that the family became concerned.
I got a phone call, I think it was about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was Sheila, and she said, "Is Anthony there, Malcolm?" And I said, "Good God, no." She said, "He hasn't come home." I said, "Right, I'll go and have a look." And I went out in my car to look for him.
As their concerns increased, Malcolm would be joined by Anthony's brother, Gary, as they scoured the local area. But with still no sign of the 35-year-old, the family reported the matter to the police. PC Phil Greaves was just starting out on his early shift.
Night shift just mentioned to me that there was a person missing. They mentioned the vehicle he was missing in. And I just took it as an adult missing, could go anywhere.
Anthony's car was eventually found at nearby Pensarn Beach. Former Detective Constable Dave Morris recalls the scene in the deserted car park.
During the early hours of the morning, local police officers came across Tony's vehicle, which was parked in this sort of vicinity here, across the road from the amusement arcade. And Tony wasn't in the car, there was no sign of him.
I had a quick look round. I couldn't see him sleeping in doorways or anything like that, so I just jumped onto the sea wall.
The tide was out, but was coming in at that point in time. And as they walked onto the beach, had a general search of the beach area. They noticed a shape further on the beach.
You could see it was a person, head towards the sea, feet up the beach, quite close to the water's edge.
But the policeman's initial assessment was interrupted.
I heard a vehicle stop, looked up, and a guy jumps over the wall rather quickly, comes running down the beach towards me.
It was Gary Davis, the man who had spent the last few hours frantically searching for his missing brother, Anthony.
He went down to have a look, and they were dragging him out of the sea. And Gary said, "Shine a light on him." And they shined a light, and he said, "That's my brother," he said.
It was apparent that Anthony Davis had not died of natural causes.
So we moved the body up the beach, and only while moving the body up the beach that his jumper came up and saw the horrific wounds and realised, you know, he'd been stabbed umpteen times.
There were signs that Tony had put up a fight. There was a lot of debris moved about on the beach. There was evidence in this area here of a struggle. There was blood on the stones, on the rocks, and eventually Tony Davis was stabbed to death and he collapsed and died on the beach here.
News of the brutal murder soon reached the victim's close-knit family.
That day, I'll never forget it. It was horrible. We just couldn't digest it. It just wasn't right. We couldn't believe somebody's murdered him. He didn't have an enemy.
You'll never forget that pain that we suffered at that time. No, I'll never forget the way my family were different. Everything changed in the click of a fingers, it just changed. Our life just fell apart.
As investigators searched for clues to Anthony's murder, they were aware that Pensarn Beach had been the scene of unprovoked violence before. Rumoured to be a gay meeting point, several men had suffered attacks by a mystery assailant over the preceding years.
It was described, rightly or wrongly at the time, as a notorious stretch of the beach.
We were aware that there'd been some men attacked on Pensarn Beach historically by a tall man who wore black leather clothing and quite violently assaulted and robbed people.
But as the community reeled, one local man appeared firmly focused on business.
I remember his first film, it was Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and that was a really good film, and everybody was so excited because it hadn't been out for long.
The Christmas holiday was traditionally a busy time of year for local cinema owner Peter Moore.
At one stage he mentioned that he'd had, I think it was 1,200 people through the doors in 1 week.
Championed as a saviour of the big screen, Moore had opened his first local cinema 5 years previously.
He began by taking over the old cinema at Baggilt. He bought some old theatre seats from in Rill, I believe, and put those in. Understandably, the communities were only too pleased that the cinemas were opening in their areas.
I thought he was great, and a lot of other people, the residents of the village, should think he was great. He was a very laid-back person, had a good manner about him, very polite. He was an ideal person to be running the cinema.
Film enthusiast Peter Moore had been born 49 years previously, in 1946.
The Moore family moved to Kinmel Bay from St Helens when Peter Moore was a very young child.
Catherine Hughes lived next door to the Moores and their imposing custom-built home, Darlington House.
Kinmel Bay was very rural. It only consisted of a post office, a chip shop, newsagents and a confectioner's. Darlington House was the most prominent building, but everywhere else was fields.
They were definitely well respected in the area, and they would have been one of the more affluent people in Kinmel Bay at that point in time.
There was no other building around that was like this. and the status that it gave to the Moore family. It was almost like they were the lord and lady of the manor, and Peter was their, you know, up-and-coming prince, if you like.
Peter Moore's parents made their money running a successful hardware shop on the ground floor of the property.
I think it was more basically an ironmonger's from memory. Apart from groceries, I suppose he sold everything. And when you went in, it was pretty cluttered, like kettles and things hanging off hooks.
As a boy, Peter had been doted on by his mother.
Mrs. Moore loved Peter unconditionally. I don't think she believed that Peter could do anything wrong. I think her love for him was more than her love for Mr. Moore. He loved her to pieces as well.
Peter Moore had always stood out from his peers.
I think it was obvious to others that Peter was gay from when he was a young teenager. Certainly he was different from the other boys. The other boys knew he was different, and I think they treated him accordingly.
Although close to his mother, Peter's relationship with his father appeared very different.
I never saw any affection between Peter and his dad, or Mr. Moore and Mrs. Moore. They were like two separate units.
While the young Peter and his mother spent most of their time together, Ernie, Peter's father, was dedicated to running the successful business.
He was quite large in stature. You could tell that Mr. Moore had been a military man by the way he held himself, and he almost marched. But he liked to drink. He would have a whiskey tipple probably on and off throughout the day. My dad told me not to spend any time alone with him, so I didn't. Don't know why, but that's what I was told to do.
I do remember Mr. Moore, Mrs. Peter's father, coming in, and he was absolutely plastered from alcohol one day, and this was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Peter did mention at some stage that he had been violent towards him.
I think Mr. Moore knew that Peter was gay, and I don't think he liked it. I do think Mr. Moore was probably quite homophobic towards Peter. He didn't tolerate his mannerisms, he didn't tolerate his personality, and he would tell Peter off.
When they're humiliated young, they want to be sure this never happens again. And they will resent the source of that humiliation deeply, whether it's their father, their mother, a teacher, whoever it is, that person is going to become symbolic to them. And when they get to the point where they have enough power to react against some symbol of that source, they will.
Those that knew the industrious cinema owner could never have imagined the dark way his life would play out. During December 1995, the body of 35-year-old Anthony Davis had been found brutally stabbed on Pensarn Beach in North Wales. It began to emerge that a series of attacks had been occurring in the region for decades at the hands of a violent, sadistic man.
I had been aware of various assaults having been reported over the years.
Men were getting attacked during the late hours of the evening.
Apparently he was jumping out, following people, and he'd batter them.
They were pretty violent attacks. They were generally attacked from behind with what we believe was a rubber cosh.
One or two I know the victims were lucky to survive.
I interviewed one who was so badly hurt that he lived the rest of his life in a nursing home.
This person who was attacked said, I was convinced he was going to kill me. He was definitely going to kill me.
People who've been attacked, they had an idea that of his description, this big bloke and so on, and dressed in black.
Despite police efforts, the mystery assailant had remained at large for more than 20 years. But in 1995, the sadistic violence would reach a whole new level. On the 22nd of September, retired railway worker Henry Roberts had spent the majority of the day at home. It was a routine he had followed since the death of his mother 9 years previously.
He lived in a pretty ramshackle place in Cargailog, a village just a few miles from Holyhead. Locally it was hinted that he could be gay, but he was a man who was respected.
Henry was a bachelor, a guy who lived, I'd say, all his life. The people that knew Henry regarded him as a recluse, a loner, quite eccentric.
Henry also had a controversial hobby.
It was known that he had this interest in Nazi memorabilia.
As a creature of habit, Henry would leave his ramshackle cottage and take a daily stroll to the local pub.
Henry lived in this location here, but he would walk every day to Cargailog, which is just down the road here, about a quarter mile away, to the pub. And that was his lifestyle. He'd go to the pub every day and walk home back to his cottage.
I think someone said he once spent up to £100 a night on buying drinks, and local people knew that he had a fair amount of cash.
So regular were his visits. When Henry didn't show up at the pub for 3 days in a row, locals became worried.
He hadn't been seen in the pub for a couple of days, so they were concerned for his welfare. Some guys from the pub came here, they came through the gates, walked into the yard, and that's when they found Henry's body. He'd been lying there for some time.
As police arrived on the scene, they were shocked to discover that the 56-year-old had been the victim of murder.
It was a horrific attack, a brutal attack.
Henry Roberts had been stabbed dozens of times.
His trousers had been pulled down. His bare buttocks were on display. And it was quite apparent that he'd been stabbed to the buttocks on a number of occasions.
A post-mortem would reveal that the killer had delayed the fatal blow to prolong the victim's ordeal.
When you stab someone and they don't die, they're in pain, they're suffering, and this is arousing for an individual who's sadistic. He disabled the person, made him suffer, and then after an extended period of time, finally killed the person, just to prolong the sexual stimulation of the entire act.
Investigators had little to go on, but one sighting offered a potential lead.
A van had been seen in the driveway, not on the night of the murder, but some days before the murder. So there was a lot of concentration on trying to identify the van and the driver of the van.
Local businessman and cinema owner Peter Moore would often crisscross the region by van. 16 years previously, his father, Ernie Moore, had passed away, leaving his 33-year-old son to run the family hardware store with the support of his doting mother.
When his father died and he took over the business, then the business changed really dramatically. They didn't sell as many tools or gardening equipment. It became more like a general store, and he brought in video hire.
It was a busy shop, although I don't think he was making a lot of money. He had a lot of customers coming and going throughout the day. The large supermarket chain had opened about half a mile away from the shop, and I think it had a bit of an adverse effect on his business. So Peter sort of diverged a little bit.
He also ventured into using the upstairs hall and converted it into a disco, and it was called the Black Cat Disco. There was a lot of upset with the local community because they didn't want bright lights late at night and loud music because it wasn't soundproofed.
Peter Moore was also prepared to travel the local area, selling gas to boost his profit margins.
The caravan people could phone him up at 10 o'clock at night and say, Peter, look, I'm run out of gas, and he'd just jump in his van and deliver the gas bottle down there, and then they thought he was a wonderful man.
But it was not all plain sailing for the seemingly amenable shopkeeper. Local policeman Dave Morris would make frequent visits to the Moores' business at Darlington House.
We'd always be called here by Peter. There'd be an incident going on. Generally it was like a shoplifting offence, damage to his property.
But on entering the shop, the policeman would pick up on a distinct atmosphere.
One of the things I noticed when I used to visit the shop was that the staff were always very reluctant to speak to us. It was quite apparent that Peter was a gay man. The staff that would work for him were normally people he was in a relationship with. I formed the opinion, even then, that Peter was quite a sort of a dominant character.
Fellow shop owner Mike Owen recalls a character who also revelled in the limelight on the shop floor.
A good shopkeeper is an exhibitionist. They have a centre of attraction. They're trying to sell you something. And Peter Moore, I think, was pretty good at that. And I think he enjoyed being centre stage.
Despite Peter's apparent control, his mother Edith remained firmly in charge behind the scenes.
After we'd sort of spoken to Peter and told him that we'd sort of look into his complaint, then we'd have to go and report back to his mother. She seemed to still regard him as her little boy, despite the fact that he was a grown man running a business and providing for his mother.
I think she tried to keep him more of a child. I don't think she actually wanted him to grow up.
Away from the family business, Peter Moore would indulge his lifelong passion for film by renovating and opening the first of 3 local cinemas in 1990. Whilst carrying out some works for his new venture, Brian Dolman was quickly befriended by Moore.
I went up in the projector with him a few times, really, and he used to tell me all about how this worked, how the films were made, and how the projectors worked, and what lighting you needed and what positions you had to be in. He was very, very intense.
One of Moore's most popular screenings was the Saturday Cinema Club, a chance for parents to drop off their kids whilst they did their weekend shopping.
People would bring their children to the cinema, and Peter would look after them till they came back. He thought the world of all the children, and he was keen to please them and make them happy to come to the cinema. He was a real gentleman.
But there was a darker side to the cinema owner.
I can remember now, sleazy. You certainly wouldn't have walked out of them under your arm.
A man who was well known. Nobody could have guessed that he had such a secret, a dark side to his personality.
I was aware that he had a liking to wear leather clothes and had this nightlife that he didn't display in front of his mother. She was totally unaware of that side of things.
When he went out, he was always dressed in black. It was his trademark, the long black leather coat, either a black or a dark grey shirt, a black tie, black trousers.
And as he cruised the local streets, no one could have imagined the secret life that was unfolding in the increasingly twisted world of Peter Moore. During September 1995, the peaceful communities on the Isle of Anglesey were shattered by the brutal murder of local man Henry Roberts. Only the sighting of a van offered a potential clue to police as they hunted down the sadistic killer. Two months later, he struck again.
Keith Randalls was living in a caravan. He was acting as a road traffic safety officer while some construction work was carried on there.
We enjoyed each other's company. You know, he was a fantastic guy. Fantastic. We'd do raffles and anything to get some money in, because we used to send it off to hospitals and stuff like that. We used to take the old age pensioners on coach trips.
He was a very happy-go-lucky sort of person.
Very dry sense of humour, isn't
Yes, very dry sense of humour. Everybody who met him, everybody that knew him, seemed to like him.
With Christmas only a matter of weeks away, the 49-year-old was looking forward to visiting his daughter Lisa and her family.
We did have a really long conversation and he was really happy and upbeat and looking forward to Christmas because he was coming to ours for Christmas dinner.
Family meant the world to him.
On the night in question, Keith had decided to treat himself after a long day at work.
He'd been into Llangefni. I think he'd had a pint in the pub and then bought some chips and had come home with a bag of chips back to the caravan.
The following morning, Keith's work colleagues turned up to the site as usual. But something was very wrong.
It was a busy road site and the guys would come back next morning to start the day's work. And they found Keith's body outside of the caravan and contacted the police.
As detectives arrived on the scene, it would immediately become apparent that Keith Randalls had been the victim of murder. All the signs suggested he had suffered a prolonged, vicious attack.
The evidence showed that Keith had come out of the caravan, which is here, and that a scuffle had sort of taken place in this area here, and there were signs of a big struggle. And as they were fighting, Keith was getting stabbed repeatedly, and yet he was still managing to fight. And Keith was left to die here, where we're standing now.
He was pulled out of his caravan, killed without any mercy at all, in a completely motiveless attack.
You can imagine Keith thinking, you know, when somebody knocks on the door of the caravan, they're lost and they want some information. You know, not somebody gonna stab 9 times.
It completely tore us all apart. It was just something that you read in the newspapers, but it's not something you expect to happen to your family. And especially to sort of person that my dad was. He was never offensive to anybody. I couldn't see how anybody would want to do him any harm.
The brutal stabbing bore all the hallmarks of the recent killing of Henry Roberts, less than 10 miles away.
The police had to look at the possibility that there was one person responsible for both murders. Both males, both live alone, both stabbed to death. Again, a van had been sighted. A van was sort of prevalent in both murders. Possibly the offender was using a van to travel across the island.
Just an hour's drive east, Kinmel Bay businessman Peter Moore was now living on his own, following the death of his beloved mother 19 months previously.
When Mrs. Moore passed away, Peter was heartbroken. And he became quite introvert. He seemed to have a lot of pent-up anger, which I never could understand why. But I just felt that he's grieving for Mrs. Moore, grieving for his mum.
As Moore's hardware shop began to struggle, the lifelong film enthusiast had thrown himself into his true passion and opened a third local cinema in Holyhead, Anglesey.
I think Peter probably did want to build an empire. I think he probably had a vision that he would open lots of old cinemas and wake them up.
At that time, there was great interest in North Wales because this was the man who was resurrecting the cinema trade.
But in reality, the cinema business was struggling, and Peter Moore's private life was also spiralling out of control.
Once his mother died, he became entrenched in the S&M underworld because it wouldn't matter to him if he was discovered. He would not lose his mother's love because she was dead.
I don't want to imagine what went on. I heard noises, and I've heard neighbours talk about, things that they'd heard and suspected. But I cannot believe that this house turned into a house of horrors.
People just saw him as probably, a cinema buff, and they didn't know really what was inside of him, which was the real thing in terms of domination, sadism, and inflicting pain and horror and hurting people and frightening people. That's who he was.
And as Peter Moore's secret life of sadism continued, he would decide to treat himself as he reached his 49th year.
For his birthday, he bought himself a present, and the present was bought from a shopping rail. And it was a commando dagger in a sheath.
Three months later, in December 1995, Anthony Davis became the third man to be murdered in North Wales within a matter of weeks. For Detective Constable Dave Morris, there was no doubt that the Anglesey killer had struck again.
There were some striking similarities to the previous two murders. There was a lone male, alone at night, and had been stabbed to death.
The latest killing had been perpetrated on Pensarn Beach, a known meeting point for gay men, and the scene of several violent assaults over the preceding years.
They did immediately appeal to the gay community for information through the press.
And within a matter of days, the police received an anonymous tip-off.
A gentleman described being approached by this man in black leather on Pensarn Beach and taken to an address in Kimmel Bay. At that address, he was badly assaulted. He'd been beaten, he'd been lashed, and he believed that he was going to die at the house and was lucky to get away with his life.
As an ex-Bobby on the beat, Detective Constable Morris was tasked with finding the house in Kimmel Bay.
The caller gave a description of the house, and he described as he drive along the coast road to the traffic lights in Kimmel Bay. I loosely followed the description to the traffic lights. We turn right, and the house is on the right-hand side.
And the house that lay before him was a familiar sight. It belonged to local businessman Peter Moore.
I was able to make the connection. Peter Moore lives in that house. I know Peter Moore's a gay man. I know Peter Moore wears black leather because I've seen him, so I formed the opinion that he was a very good suspect.
Police then established that Moore was hiring a van that matched the description of those witnessed at the murder scenes. He was arrested. A knife was found in the van, and as police entered Moore's family home, they found evidence linking him to the murders of Anthony Davis, Keith Randalls, and Henry Roberts.
In the hallway downstairs, Tony Davis's coat was hanging up. It had been washed. Underneath the settee in his living area, they pulled the video recorder out and it corroborated with the serial number of the video recorder taken from Keith's caravan. There was a swastika flag hanging up in this bedroom. He'd actually taken that swastika flag from Henry's property.
Sexual murderers will very often take souvenirs or trophies from a crime scene, and they do it so that they can relive the crime by using the object that they took as a stimulus for their fantasies.
Inside the once grand Darlington house, investigators would find further evidence of Peter Moore's secret life.
In the house there was all sorts of unusual things. There was whips, there was rubber truncheons, there was German helmets, German caps, and there was signs that S&M activity had been taking place in the house.
There'd be blood spatters on the walls and on the ceilings that marked the place where the blood had landed from, some sort of whip or something similar that would flick blood onto the ceiling.
It was so incongruous. You had these things like truncheons and uniforms there alongside fluffy toys on the bed.
And the unusual thing was that all the rooms had various signs of the S&M interest, but his mother's bedroom was kept intact. Even in death, he had the respect for his mother to keep it out of her bedroom.
But the sadist hadn't finished inflicting pain, and the friends and families of the victims would be next to be subjected to his cruelty. In December 1995, local cinema owner Peter Moore had confessed to the sadistic killings of 3 men in North Wales. Now in custody, Moore appeared to be revelling in the limelight.
He came out of Colwyn Bay cells into the prison van, and under normal circumstances the offender's covered, but when he came out he almost looked at the cameras and seemed to wallow in the fact that he was the man that's done it.
He would pose and he would smile. He was a very wicked man.
Looking on in pain and horror were the loved ones of the men whose lives he had viciously snuffed out.
He was televised a lot and shown pictures a lot, and it could be quite distressing putting the telly on to see him waving his arms about.
I can remember seeing the picture of him on the telly with his cuffs on and kind of making a gesture of his hands in the air like that, you know, and I'll never forget that.
I think he just enjoyed being the center of attention. It was his 15 minutes of fame, the cameras were there and they were rolling and he was going to put on a show.
Moore had confessed to the 3 murders, as well as over 50 assaults carried out in North Wales. But the exhibitionist didn't want the show to end.
He told us about a 4th murder, a murder that we weren't aware of. We didn't know about the murder of Edward Carthy at the time that we were investigating the other murders. It was very much a revelation to us, really.
Moore provided a detailed map, pinpointing exactly where he had cruelly knifed to death the vulnerable man in the tranquil beauty of a forest.
I think there was an element of him exercising his control, his domination over the police. There's no doubt that he got some form of pleasure from telling us about a murder that he committed that we didn't know about. Basically, literally one he got away with.
The reason that Moore, when he confessed, actually revealed another victim that the police did not know about is because now that he's caught, he wants to take charge. And he wants to be quite infamous and notorious.
Peter Moore faced trial for the 4 murders in November 1996. In court, his brazen behaviour would become an increasingly harrowing experience for the victims' families.
Every time he talked, and we were watching him, he'd have eye contact with us. And he kept looking at us with a smirk on his face.
I couldn't help it. I had to look at him, and he just looked straight back at me, and there was just nothing but what looked like humour behind his eyes. Yeah, he was just smirking.
He was absolutely enjoying every minute. It's as if he was on stage.
He thought himself a Hollywood star. Going to and from the court, you'd see a big smile and his hands in the air. Look at me, I'm Peter Moore. I'd bloody give him Peter Moore.
Despite his bravado, Peter Moore was found guilty of all 4 murders and sentenced to life in prison.
He didn't look remorseful once. There was never any hint at all of any upset or anything from him.
Ultimately, one question remained. Was Peter Moore's murderous campaign the final act of a sordid and violent script? Or was he born to kill?
The attacks may have been motivated because of his relationship with his father as a child growing up. He was attacking men in the late 50s, 60s, possibly, as you could argue, his father's generation. The majority of the guys were all coming home from the pub. Peter made it quite clear to me that he didn't approve of drinking alcohol. His father drank alcohol. He didn't like his father drinking alcohol. He was attacking his father's way of life. He was attacking his father, basically.
Individuals like this, they don't wake up one morning and say, I think I'll go out and kill 5 women or 5 men and torture them to death. That sounds like a good thing. No, this begins 10, 15, 20 years earlier in the offender's mind, in his fantasies.
I do think Peter Moore was born to kill. I think the attacks throughout the 1970s and the 1980s were preparation for what was to come. I think it was always inside him. And once he committed that first murder, there was no going back then.
I think he was born to kill. He went out intentionally to harm people. For whatever reason, he was out to kill.
I think bad men come up with excuses. There is no excuse for what Peter Moore did.
I would say he had the predilection to become a killer simply because of the way he naturally took on the sadistic role. He certainly was vulnerable to becoming a killer.
Whilst Peter Moore remains safely locked away to this day, the pain of his murderous spree still touches the loved ones of those innocent men who lost their lives.
We have a lot of family get-togethers, and we are close family, aren't we? So any special occasions, any events that happen, he's always missed. He should be there, and he would have been there. So he's always missed.
We've never been able to move on. I think we've got to the stage now we just live with it. I know my wife misses him. I see her of a night time, sitting there, and I can see the tears. That's how much she misses him. Anthony's memory, that's what we live for now.
The call came just after dawn, when the Florida heat had not yet burned the fog off the ground, when the world still felt briefly suspended between night and day, and a voice on the other end of the line said there was a body, and that everything about it felt wrong. A quiet neighborhood. A modest house. No signs of forced entry. No screaming witnesses. Just silence, thick and unnatural, pressing down on the scene as patrol cars rolled in and red lights began to pulse against pastel walls. In 1998, Florida had already seen its share of violence, but this was different. This felt deliberate. This felt personal. This felt like the beginning of something that would not let go. Inside the house, time seemed frozen. A television left on. A coffee mug on the counter, cold. The victim lay where life had ended abruptly, violently, without warning. No weapon in sight. No note. No explanation. The air carried that unmistakable stillness investigators know too well, the kind that signals a story has been cut off mid-sentence. Neighbors gathered behind yellow tape, whispering, speculating, watching strangers walk in and out of a place that had seemed ordinary only hours before. Shock spread quickly. By noon, the community knew one thing for certain: someone among them was capable of this. Detectives moved fast at first. They always do. Photographs. Measurements. Gloved hands hovering over surfaces, careful not to disturb what little the scene was willing to give up. Fingerprints were lifted. Fibers collected. Blood spatter documented. There were no obvious signs of struggle, which only deepened the unease. Whoever had done this hadn't panicked. They hadn't rushed. They had known exactly what they were doing, and that knowledge lingered in the room like a threat. The victim was not a stranger, not a recluse, not someone living on the margins. They had routines. Friends. A job. A presence in the community that made the crime impossible to dismiss as random. Interviews began immediately. Co-workers described someone reliable, predictable. Neighbors recalled casual conversations, small talk over fences, nothing that hinted at danger. Family members, summoned in disbelief, struggled to reconcile the image they knew with the brutality investigators described. Every answer led to more questions. Every detail refused to line up cleanly. Within days, the case dominated local news. Headlines spoke of a mysterious killing, of fear creeping into quiet streets. Residents locked doors earlier, watched strangers longer, wondered if safety had been an illusion all along. Detectives followed leads as they came, chasing rumors, checking alibis, mapping out the victim's final hours minute by minute. Someone had to have seen something. A car. A face. A sound in the night. But memories blurred. Timelines conflicted. The trail refused to take shape. Then there was the evidence. Or rather, the lack of it. No murder weapon recovered. No clear point of entry. No eyewitnesses placing a suspect at the scene. Forensic testing in 1998 could only go so far, and what it did reveal raised more doubts than answers. Biological material was found, yes, but not enough to tell a complete story. Not enough to put a name to the violence. It was catalogued, sealed, logged into evidence, and quietly placed into storage, waiting for a future that no one could yet imagine. Weeks turned into months. Months into years. The investigation slowed, then stalled. Leads dried up. Persons of interest were cleared or faded into the background of other lives. Detectives rotated off the case, replaced by others who read through binders of reports, trying to feel the urgency their predecessors had once felt. The victim's family kept asking the same questions, and the answers never changed. We're still working on it. We haven't forgotten. These things take time. But time, in this case, seemed to be doing the opposite. It was erasing edges, dulling memories, burying urgency beneath new crimes, new headlines. By the early 2000s, the case had a new label, one that carried its own quiet weight: cold case. 2 words that meant the violence was no longer fresh, but no less unresolved. 2 words that suggested distance, not closure. The file sat on shelves, thick with paper, heavy with unanswered questions. Occasionally, a tip would come in, a call from someone who thought they remembered something, someone who had heard a rumor at a bar, someone driven by guilt or imagination. Each tip was logged, assessed, and ultimately dismissed. None survived scrutiny. The community changed. New families moved in. Old neighbors moved away. The house where it happened was sold, repainted, renovated. Life, indifferent and relentless, continued. But beneath the surface, the crime remained a point of tension, a story parents told teenagers as a warning, a name spoken softly when conversations drifted toward unsolved mysteries. The fear never fully disappeared. It simply learned how to live quietly. Inside evidence storage, sealed envelopes and labeled containers waited in darkness. Technology advanced elsewhere. DNA science evolved. What had once been impossible became routine. Profiles could be built from fragments. Matches could be found across databases spanning states, even countries. But for years, the Florida 1998 case remained untouched by these breakthroughs, trapped in the limitations of its time. Until it wasn't. Nearly 2 decades later, a renewed push to re-examine cold cases swept through departments across the country. Old evidence was pulled. New eyes looked at old facts. In Florida, someone opened the box from 1998. The biological material was still there. Preserved. Intact. Silent. Technicians began the careful process of extracting a DNA profile using methods that hadn't existed when the crime first occurred. In a lab far removed from the crime scene's quiet terror, machines hummed, data assembled, and a genetic code emerged where once there had been only uncertainty. When the profile was run through national databases, investigators didn't expect much. Many cold cases end the same way they began, with hope fading into another dead end. But this time, the screen didn't stay blank. A hit appeared. Then another. Not a direct match, but something just as powerful, a familial connection. A thread. A possibility. For the first time in years, the case breathed again. Detectives, who had never stood in that house in 1998, now found themselves studying grainy photographs, rereading witness statements, trying to bridge a gap of 20 years. The name that surfaced was not one they recognized from the old files. That alone was unsettling. Had the killer been overlooked entirely, moving unnoticed through the early investigation? Or had they been hiding in plain sight, dismissed too quickly, protected by coincidence and timing? As word spread internally, excitement mixed with caution. DNA can point. It can suggest. But it can also mislead if handled without care. Investigators rebuilt timelines, cross-referenced addresses, employment records, travel histories. They traced family trees, mapped relationships, and slowly, painstakingly, a picture began to form. The suspect had lived an unremarkable life, at least on the surface. No obvious criminal history. No public connection to the victim that anyone could immediately explain. Which only deepened the mystery. Why this person? Why this crime? Why now? When the arrest finally came, it didn't look like justice triumphant. It looked like confusion. A quiet knock. Handcuffs clicking closed on someone who insisted there had been a mistake. Cameras captured the moment, and the footage spread quickly. Headlines exploded. Florida 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough stuns investigators. The words were bold. Definitive. Reassuring. They suggested an ending, a full stop after years of uncertainty. But endings in cases like this are rarely that clean. As the suspect was led away, questions followed close behind. Motive remained unclear. The connection to the victim, tenuous at best. Defense attorneys pointed to the decades that had passed, the memories that had faded, the evidence handled by countless hands. Supporters of the arrest called it a victory for science, proof that time no longer protected the guilty. Skeptics wondered aloud if desperation for closure had rushed the truth. For the victim's family, the announcement brought a rush of emotions that refused to settle into anything simple. Relief tangled with doubt. Hope collided with grief that had never truly healed. After 20 years of waiting, they were being told this was it. This was the answer. But answers, when they come this late, have a way of reopening wounds rather than closing them. In the community, the story returned with force. Old fears resurfaced. People revisited memories, asking themselves what they might have missed back then, what signs they might have ignored. Some felt vindicated. Others felt uneasy. Because even as officials spoke confidently about DNA and breakthroughs, there was an undercurrent that refused to disappear. A sense that something about the story still didn't quite fit. And as the case moved toward court, as evidence was prepared for a modern audience, one truth remained unavoidable. A cold case can be declared solved on paper, but that doesn't mean its shadow stops reaching into the present. The Florida 1998 case had been awakened from its long sleep, but whether it had truly been laid to rest was a question no headline could answer, and one that would continue to haunt everyone who had ever stood behind that yellow tape, staring at a quiet house, wondering how silence could hide so much. The courtroom lights were harsher than the morning sun had been back in 1998, and as cameras clicked and reporters leaned forward, the story shifted from quiet files and sealed boxes into something louder, sharper, and far more fragile. Prosecutors spoke with confidence, their words precise, rehearsed, built around a single pillar that did not exist 20 years earlier, DNA. They described science as an unblinking witness, incapable of forgetting, incapable of lying. In their telling, the case was no longer a mystery, but a delayed revelation, truth merely waiting for technology to catch up. Yet as the narrative unfolded, the gaps became impossible to ignore, like missing frames in a film that refused to play smoothly. The DNA evidence, powerful as it sounded, came from a fragment so small it bordered on the miraculous that it had survived at all. Collected under conditions far less controlled than modern standards, stored through years of departmental moves, evidence room reorganizations, and administrative turnover, it had passed through many hands. Each transfer documented. Each seal noted. But time leaves marks no log can fully explain. Defense attorneys would later circle this point relentlessly, reminding the jury that evidence is only as trustworthy as the path it takes through history. Investigators returned to the scene in their minds, replaying what could no longer be physically revisited. The house had changed owners twice since the crime. Walls repainted. Floors replaced. Whatever secrets had been embedded in that space were long gone. All that remained were photographs, grainy and flat, unable to capture the atmosphere officers had felt when they first stepped inside. That sensation, the wrongness, the deliberate quiet, could not be entered into evidence. It lived only in memory. As the prosecution outlined a reconstructed timeline, they leaned heavily on the idea of opportunity. The suspect, they argued, had been in the area. Records placed them nearby on the day of the murder, though not at the house, not with the victim, not in any way that felt definitive. Nearby became a flexible term, stretched to fit the narrative. In 1998, that proximity had meant nothing. Now, in light of DNA, it was being reinterpreted as significance. Coincidence reshaped into implication. Witnesses from the original investigation were called, their recollections filtered through decades of living. Some spoke carefully, choosing words with visible effort, aware that memory is a fragile thing. Others were more confident, perhaps too confident, filling in gaps with certainty that hadn't existed in their original statements. Transcripts from 1998 didn't always match what was being said now, and those discrepancies hovered in the room, unspoken but heavy. The defense strategy was simple in concept and complex in execution: doubt everything. They questioned the collection methods, the storage conditions, the interpretation of the DNA results. They raised the possibility of secondary transfer, contamination, laboratory error. They reminded the jury that DNA can place someone's biological material at a location without proving when or how it arrived there. Science could suggest presence. It could not explain intent. It could not speak to motive. And motive, in this case, remained a void. The suspect themselves sat quietly, expression unreadable, occasionally leaning toward their attorney, whispering behind a raised hand. To some observers, the stillness looked like guilt. To others, it looked like shock. After living an unremarkable life for decades, they were now being publicly tethered to a brutal act, their name forever linked to a headline that promised resolution. Friends and acquaintances came forward, stunned, describing someone ordinary, forgettable, incapable, in their minds, of the violence being described. Such testimonies rarely carry legal weight, but they matter in the court of public opinion, where narratives are shaped as much by disbelief as by facts. Outside the courthouse, the victim's family navigated a strange emotional terrain. Cameras sought their reactions, microphones hovered, waiting for a sound bite that could summarize decades of pain. Some family members spoke of relief, of gratitude that science had finally answered what humans could not. Others were more cautious, their faces tight with uncertainty. Closure is a word often used by those who do not have to live with its consequences. For them, the past was not something to be closed. It was something that had become part of their identity. As the trial progressed, the media simplified what the courtroom complicated. Headlines reduced arguments to declarations. DNA equals guilt. Cold case solved. Justice delayed but delivered. Nuance disappeared in favor of certainty, because certainty sells and doubt does not. But inside the courtroom, doubt was everywhere, threading its way through testimony, clinging to unanswered questions like static. Why had there been no clear connection between the suspect and the victim? No shared workplace. No documented relationship. No witnesses placing them together. Prosecutors suggested a fleeting encounter, an interaction too brief to leave a trace beyond what ended up sealed in an evidence bag. Defense attorneys countered that such speculation filled the gaps with imagination rather than proof. The truth, they argued, should not require invention. The original detectives, some now retired, watched from the gallery or from home, their reactions mixed. For years, the case had sat unresolved, a quiet failure they carried with them. The DNA hit felt like vindication, proof that the work they had done mattered after all. Yet even among them, there were murmurs of unease. They knew the case too well to believe in easy endings. They remembered the leads that went nowhere, the suspects who almost fit, but didn't, the feeling that something essential had always remained just out of reach. As days in court blurred together, the jury absorbed a story stretched across 2 eras. They were asked to evaluate decisions made with outdated tools, to judge actions through the lens of modern science, to reconcile human memory with machine-generated certainty. It was a heavy task, and the weight of it showed in their faces as they filed in and out, notebooks filling with contradictions. Beyond the courtroom, the community watched closely. Old conversations resurfaced. People compared notes, recalling where they had been in 1998, what they had heard, what they had believed back then. Some felt reassured that the system, slow as it was, eventually worked. Others felt a quiet dread, wondering if the wrong person might be paying for a crime simply because time demanded an answer. The trial approached its end with no dramatic revelations, no last-minute confession, no piece of evidence that suddenly aligned everything into clarity. Instead, it closed the way it had unfolded, layer by layer, argument by argument, uncertainty pressing in from all sides. Closing statements echoed through the room, the prosecution urging trust in science, the defense urging respect for doubt. Both spoke with conviction. Only one could prevail. When the jury retired to deliberate, the building seemed to exhale. Reporters speculated. Families waited. The suspect stared at the floor. Hours passed. Then more. Each minute stretched, heavy with possibility. A verdict, whatever it would be, promised consequences that could not be undone. And yet, even before the jury returned, a realization hung unspoken in the air. Regardless of the outcome, something about the Florida 1998 case would remain unresolved. Not legally, perhaps. Not officially. But emotionally. Logically. The kind of unresolved that lingers beneath verdicts and sentences, beneath headlines and press conferences, whispering that truth is not always as complete as the stories told about it. When the jury finally filed back in, the room rose as one. The four-person's hands trembled slightly, paper held tight. Silence settled, thick and expectant. In that moment, before any words were spoken, the case existed in a fragile state, balanced between past and present, between science and doubt, between the promise of resolution and the fear that the mystery, despite everything, was not finished yet. The verdict landed without drama, no gasp, no audible reaction, just a quiet statement read aloud that instantly altered the trajectory of multiple lives. Guilty. One word, heavy enough to carry 20 years of waiting, sharp enough to cut through doubt, final enough to satisfy headlines that had already decided how the story should end. Cameras caught the moment the suspect absorbed it, eyes fixed forward, expression barely shifting, as if bracing for an impact that had been approaching for months. For the victim's family, the word echoed differently in each chest, relief for some, disbelief for others, a strange mixture of triumph and grief that refused to settle into anything clean. Sentencing followed, formal and restrained, the language of the court struggling to contain the weight of what was being imposed. Decades in prison for a life already half-lived. The judge spoke of justice, of accountability, of the power of science to correct the failures of time. Applause was not allowed, but satisfaction hung in the air nonetheless, especially outside the courthouse where statements were given and microphones clustered close. Florida 1998 cold case solved. The phrase was repeated until it began to sound like fact rather than claim. But even as the system moved forward, something underneath it resisted. Appeals were filed almost immediately, thick documents arguing that certainty had been mistaken for truth, that the jury had been overwhelmed by the authority of DNA without fully grappling with its limitations. Experts were cited. Studies referenced. The same science that had seemed unassailable in court was now presented as complex, nuanced, capable of error when misunderstood or overstated. The legal battle continued, quieter than the trial, less visible, but no less intense. In the background, investigative journalists began to dig. Some were veterans of crime reporting, others newcomers drawn by the uneasy feeling that lingered around the case. They requested records, compared transcripts, interviewed former detectives who spoke more freely now that retirement had loosened professional restraints. Patterns emerged that had been invisible during the rush toward resolution. Early leads that had been abandoned too quickly. Witness statements that contradicted the prosecution's reconstructed timeline. A potential suspect from the original investigation, whose name had faded from memory, never fully explored, never officially cleared. These revelations didn't make headlines at first. They appeared in long-form articles, podcasts, late-night radio segments listened to by insomniacs and skeptics. The tone was careful, almost cautious, as if writers feared being accused of undermining justice rather than examining it. But the questions were there, persistent, refusing to be ignored. What if the DNA didn't tell the whole story? What if it told the wrong one? Inside the prison system, the convicted individual adjusted to a reality that bore no resemblance to the life they had known. Letters were written. Appeals prepared. Innocence was claimed, again and again, in language that grew more polished over time. Some dismissed it as denial, a common response to conviction. Others heard something else in the words, a consistency, a refusal to bend even when bending might have offered leniency. Belief, in either direction, became a matter of perspective. For the victim's family, the aftermath was not peace, but disorientation. The trial had given their grief a shape, a direction, something to move toward. Now that it was over, they were left alone with memories that felt just as sharp as they had 20 years earlier. Some avoided the media entirely, retreating from a story that had consumed too much of their lives. Others continued to speak publicly, defending the verdict, insisting that doubt was an insult to the suffering they had endured. Both responses were acts of survival. The community, too, struggled to reconcile the official narrative with lingering unease. Conversations shifted from fear to debate. Had justice been served, or merely performed? Trust in the system is a fragile thing, strengthened by certainty, weakened by ambiguity. In Florida, in that quiet neighborhood where the crime had once shattered routine, people found themselves divided. Yard signs supporting victims' rights appeared. So did whispers about wrongful convictions. The past refused to stay buried. Years passed, and the case settled into a strange limbo. Officially closed. Legally resolved. Emotionally unfinished. Law enforcement agencies cited it as a success story, an example of how cold cases could be revived with modern tools. Conferences featured it. Training sessions referenced it. The message was clear: no crime is beyond reach if science is given enough time. But among those closest to the details, certainty remained elusive. Then, unexpectedly, another development surfaced. A review of old evidence, conducted as part of a broader audit, raised questions about how the DNA sample had been interpreted. Not that it was fabricated. Not that it was mishandled in an obvious way. But that alternative explanations had not been fully explored. Secondary transfer. Environmental contamination. The possibility that the biological material had arrived at the scene without the suspect ever being present during the crime. These were not new ideas, but now they carried a different weight, sharpened by the consequences already imposed. The findings did not trigger immediate legal action. They were technical, buried in reports few people read. But they reignited discussion among experts, some of whom spoke publicly, cautiously, about the dangers of over-reliance on a single type of evidence. DNA is powerful, they said, but it is not omniscient. It answers some questions definitively and leaves others untouched. When used to fill narrative gaps, it can create an illusion of completeness where none exists. Media attention returned, quieter but more probing. Follow-up pieces asked what it truly means for a case to be solved. Is it a verdict? A confession? An explanation that satisfies every unanswered question? Or is it simply the moment when the system decides to stop asking? In the Florida 1998 case, the answer depended on who you asked. For some investigators, the case was over. They had done their duty, followed the evidence where it led, trusted the tools available to them. For others, it remained a source of private discomfort, a reminder that progress does not eliminate uncertainty, it merely changes its shape. They revisited old notes, replayed interviews in their minds, wondering if there had been a moment, years earlier, when the path could have diverged. And then there were those who could not let go, the journalists, the advocates, the listeners who heard the story late at night and felt something was off. They examined timelines, questioned assumptions, compared this case to others where certainty had later unraveled. They did not claim to know the truth. They claimed only that the truth might be more complicated than a headline allowed. As time continued its indifferent march forward, the Florida 1998 case became something more than a single crime. It became a symbol, invoked in arguments about justice, science, memory, and doubt. A reminder that solving a cold case does not always mean resolving its impact. That answers can arrive carrying new questions in their wake. Some nights, in that neighborhood, the house where it happened sits quietly, lights on, laughter drifting out, life continuing as if nothing had ever gone wrong there. But for those who know the story, who remember the foggy morning and the flashing lights, the silence still speaks. It speaks of a moment frozen in time, of a truth that may have been touched, but not fully grasped, of a mystery officially closed yet emotionally wide open. And in that space between certainty and suspicion, between verdict and doubt, the Florida 1998 cold case continues to exist, not as a file on a shelf, not as a headline, but as an unresolved presence, lingering in the collective mind, asking a question that no court, no lab, no technology has yet been able to answer completely. What really happened, and how sure can we ever be that we know? Time did what it always does when certainty is questioned. It stretched the silence, letting doubt ferment slowly, quietly, until it became impossible to ignore. Long after the cameras left and the courthouse doors closed, the Florida 1998 case continued to echo in places far removed from the original crime scene. Law school classrooms dissected it as a hypothetical. Forensic conferences debated it in hushed, technical language. Online forums pulled apart every transcript line by line, every photograph, every inconsistency, building parallel narratives that existed entirely outside official records. The appeals process moved with deliberate slowness, bound by procedure and precedent. Motions were filed, denied, revised, filed again. Each argument chipped away at the foundation of the conviction, not with accusations of malice, but with the suggestion of incompleteness. The defense did not need to prove innocence, only that certainty had been premature. That reasonable doubt had not merely existed, but had been buried under the weight of expectation, under the collective desire for an ending. At the heart of it all remained the DNA. Once a miracle, now a point of contention. Experts revisited the lab reports, scrutinizing methodology that had been state-of-the-art at the time of testing, but was already beginning to show its age. Thresholds. Mixtures. Interpretation bias. The language grew increasingly technical, increasingly abstract, as if complexity itself might obscure the human consequences tethered to each conclusion. What had once been presented as a clean, definitive match now appeared layered, conditional, dependent on assumptions rarely explained to a jury hungry for clarity. The prosecution, confident in the original outcome, resisted calls for reconsideration. To them, reopening the case threatened more than a single verdict. It threatened faith. Faith in science. Faith in progress. Faith in the idea that justice, though delayed, inevitably arrives. Admitting error, or even uncertainty, felt like inviting chaos into a system that relies on the appearance of control. And so, publicly, the stance remained firm. Privately, some began to worry. Behind closed doors, conversations took place that never reached the record. Former investigators spoke candidly about pressure from superiors, from the media, from a community exhausted by waiting. When the DNA hit arrived, it felt like a lifeline, something solid to hold onto after years of drifting. In that moment, few were inclined to slow down, to question whether the answer fit the question. Momentum carried the case forward, and momentum, once built, is difficult to stop. Meanwhile, the convicted individual's life narrowed into routine. Concrete walls. Counted steps. Days marked by meals and lights out rather than headlines and arguments. Appeals became the rhythm of hope, each filing a small rebellion against finality. Letters from supporters arrived alongside hate mail from strangers convinced of guilt. Both carried weight. Both reinforced the strange reality of being known by millions for something that remained fiercely contested. Outside, the victim's name continued to surface whenever the case was mentioned, often as punctuation rather than presence. A symbol of loss invoked to justify positions on either side. Yet the person themselves, the life interrupted, the relationships erased, remained frustratingly absent from the debate. Their story had been reduced to evidence, to exhibits, to photographs, shown briefly on a screen before attention shifted back to arguments about science and procedure. As the years passed, new technologies emerged that promised even greater precision. Genetic genealogy. Advanced probabilistic software. Techniques that could, theoretically, revisit the same evidence and extract new meaning. Calls grew louder to apply these tools, not just to confirm the existing conviction, but to test it. If the truth was solid, it would withstand scrutiny. If it was not, then scrutiny was overdue. Resistance to these calls only fueled suspicion. Why not test again? Why not look deeper? The answers given, cost, precedent, finality, sounded administrative, not principled. For those already uneasy, they felt like avoidance. And avoidance, in the realm of justice, is often indistinguishable from fear. Journalists uncovered additional details from the original investigation that had never been emphasized in court. A neighbor who reported an unfamiliar vehicle, but was dismissed as unreliable. A timeline discrepancy involving the victim's last known contact. A piece of physical evidence deemed irrelevant in 1998 and never tested. None of it proved anything on its own. But together, they suggested a broader picture, one in which the crime scene had offered more questions than the single answer eventually imposed upon it. Public opinion began to fracture more visibly. Documentaries revisited the case, presenting polished narratives that leaned heavily into ambiguity. Interviews were edited for maximum tension, music swelling beneath unanswered questions. Viewers were invited not to decide guilt or innocence, but to feel uncertainty. And many did. The case, once held up as a triumph of modern forensics, now served as a cautionary tale about overconfidence. The legal system responded slowly, as it always does, but pressure accumulated. A review panel was convened, tasked with examining whether the conviction met contemporary standards of evidentiary reliability. Their work was methodical, clinical, stripped of drama. They did not seek to tell a story. They sought to evaluate processes. And in doing so, they uncovered what processes often reveal: that decisions made under one set of assumptions can look dangerously fragile under another. Still, no immediate reversal came. No dramatic announcement. No clearing of a name or reaffirmation of guilt. Instead, the case entered a prolonged state of suspension, neither fully secure nor fully undone. A solved cold case that behaved, in every meaningful way, like an unsolved one. Officially closed, yet constantly reopened in conversation, in analysis, in memory. For the community, this ambiguity became part of the landscape. New generations learned about the crime not as a resolved chapter, but as a question mark. Teachers referenced it cautiously. Parents spoke of it as a reminder rather than a warning. The fear that once gripped the neighborhood had evolved into something more complex, a discomfort rooted not in the unknown, but in the possibility that the known might be wrong. And through it all, the original morning lingered, unchanged. The fog. The flashing lights. The silence inside a house where life had ended without explanation. No amount of legal argument, or scientific advancement, could return to that moment and extract the one thing everyone wanted most: certainty that aligned perfectly with truth. As the Florida 1998 case continued to drift between definitions, solved, contested, unresolved, it reveals something unsettling about the nature of closure itself. Closure is not a product of verdicts or technology. It is a fragile agreement between facts, feelings, and belief. When any one of those fractures, the agreement collapses. And so the case remained, suspended in that collapse. A story told and retold, each version emphasizing different details, each listener walking away with a slightly different conclusion. The file may have been stamped closed, but the question persisted, stubborn and unyielding, echoing through courtrooms, labs, living rooms, and quiet streets alike. Not whether someone had been punished. Not whether science had advanced. But whether, beneath it all, justice had actually been done. As the years accumulated, the Florida 1998 case stopped behaving like a single event and began to resemble a fault line, running quietly beneath everything built on top of it. Each new article, each new documentary, each expert panel discussion widened the crack, just enough for more questions to slip through. The justice system prefers clean conclusions, but this case resisted them, its edges frayed by time, its center hollowed out by uncertainty that refused to collapse into silence. The review panel's findings, though measured and cautious, introduced language that unsettled even those who had long defended the verdict. Phrases like interpretive subjectivity and contextual bias entered the conversation, clinical terms that nonetheless carried weight. They suggested that the DNA evidence, while not invalid, had been framed within a narrative that assumed guilt rather than tested it. The difference was subtle, but profound. Science, after all, does not operate in a vacuum. It is guided by human questions, and humans are rarely neutral. Prosecutors pushed back, emphasizing that no single piece of evidence had stood alone. They pointed to circumstantial details, to reconstructed timelines, to the absence of alternative explanations deemed credible at trial. But critics countered that those elements had only gained significance after the DNA result appeared, retrofitted into a story that needed them. Without the genetic link, they argued, the rest of the case would never have survived scrutiny. That dependency became its greatest vulnerability. Behind the scenes, law enforcement agencies grappled with an uncomfortable reality. If this conviction were overturned, it would not simply reopen one case. It would invite re-examination of others, cases where DNA had been treated as a final word rather than a starting point. The implications were vast, and fear of precedent hovered over every internal discussion. Justice systems, like any institution, are shaped as much by what they avoid as by what they confront. The convicted individual's supporters grew more organized, forming a small, but persistent advocacy group. They held meetings in borrowed spaces, circulated petitions, raised funds for expert consultations. To outsiders, they looked like many similar groups, convinced of innocence where courts had declared guilt. But what distinguished them was their focus. They did not claim to know what happened in 1998. They claimed only that the official explanation was insufficient. That knowing what did not happen can be as important as knowing what did. In prison, the passage of time took on a different texture. Appeals crawled forward, measured not in days or months, but in procedural steps. Each denial was brief, impersonal, a paragraph, or two dismissing arguments that had taken years to assemble. Hope adjusted accordingly, shrinking and expanding in cycles, never disappearing entirely. The crime itself became almost abstract, overshadowed by the fight against a system that seemed immovable. Meanwhile, the victim's family found themselves in a strange position. Once united by grief and the pursuit of answers, they now navigated internal differences about what justice meant. Some clung to the conviction as the only solid ground after decades of instability. Others admitted, quietly, that doubt had crept in. Not enough to erase belief, but enough to make certainty feel brittle. These conversations rarely happened in public. They occurred behind closed doors, in voices lowered by fear of judgment. The media's role evolved as well. Early coverage had been declarative, confident, almost celebratory. Later reporting was more restrained, aware that credibility depended on acknowledging complexity. Long timelines replaced breaking news banners. Footnotes multiplied. The case became less about shock and more about process, less about what happened and more about how conclusions are reached. For some audiences, this shift was unsatisfying. Ambiguity does not trend well. But for others, it felt closer to honesty. At forensic conferences, the case was discussed as an example of transitional science, caught between eras. Techniques once hailed as breakthroughs were now understood to require context, safeguards, humility. Experts debated how juries perceive DNA, how easily probability is mistaken for certainty, how language shapes belief. The Florida case surfaced repeatedly, not as an anomaly, but as a warning. Progress, they argued, must be accompanied by restraint. Calls for retesting the evidence grew louder. Not to undermine the original findings, but to subject them to newer methods capable of distinguishing between competing explanations. Genetic genealogy could, in theory, identify or exclude other potential contributors. Advanced software could model alternative scenarios. Yet each request was met with delays, procedural hurdles, or outright refusal. The evidence, officials said, had already served its purpose. The case was resolved. Reopening it would serve no one. But that answer satisfied fewer people with each passing year. If the purpose of evidence is truth, critics asked, how can further examination be a threat? What does finality protect, if not accuracy? The debate exposed a fundamental tension between the ideals of justice and the realities of administration. Systems are built to conclude, not to question indefinitely. Yet some questions refuse to respect those boundaries. As the 20th anniversary of the crime passed, commemorations were subdued. No official statements. No renewed appeals for information. The date slipped by almost unnoticed, marked only by a handful of articles reflecting on the distance between then and now. 2 decades had transformed a shocking murder into a case study, a cautionary tale, a symbol. The person at its center, the victim, risked being lost amid analysis and argument. In that quiet, something unexpected happened. A former witness from the original investigation came forward, not with new information, but with a retraction. They claimed their initial statement had been shaped by fear and assumption, that they had felt pressure to interpret what they saw in a way that fit what investigators seemed to expect. The revelation did not overturn anything on its own. It arrived too late, too uncertain, too unsupported. But it added another layer to the growing sense that the early narrative had been more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. The courts acknowledged the statement, then moved on. Procedurally, it changed nothing. Symbolically, it mattered. It reinforced the idea that human elements, fear, suggestion, expectation, had influenced the case from the beginning. That the line between observation and interpretation had blurred long before DNA entered the picture. As attention waned again, replaced by newer stories, newer controversies, the Florida 1998 case settled back into its uneasy equilibrium. Not forgotten. Not resolved. Suspended between belief and doubt, between institutional confidence and public skepticism. A solved cold case that continued to behave like a question. And in the spaces where certainty should have lived, there remained only fragments. A biological sample. A verdict. A series of arguments led over an absence of motive, over a lack of connection, over a silence that had never been fully explained. The kind of silence that does not fade with time, but deepens, becoming more resonant the longer it goes unanswered. By now, the case no longer asked a single question about guilt or innocence. It asked something broader, something more unsettling. How many times can a story be told before it becomes true? How much doubt can be absorbed before belief cracks? And at what point does the desire for an ending outweigh the obligation to keep looking? Those questions lingered, unanswered, as the file remained closed and the consequences remained very real. A life lost. A life imprisoned. A community forever changed. And somewhere between them, the truth, if it existed in a form that could satisfy everyone, remained just out of reach, watching as time continued its slow, indifferent march forward. By the time the case reached its 25th year, it no longer belonged to the moment of violence that created it. It belonged to memory, to interpretation, to the long shadow cast by decisions made under pressure and preserved by habit. The Florida 1998 case had become institutionalized, woven into training manuals and cautionary lectures, cited both as proof of progress and as evidence of its limits. It existed in 2 states at once, resolved and unresolved, depending entirely on where you stood. The convicted individual aged quietly behind bars, their life reduced to routines that allowed little room for anything but reflection. Grey appeared where there had been none. The outside world advanced, technologies evolving at a pace that made the science used in their trial feel almost archaic. Each advancement reopened the same question: if this had existed then, would the outcome have been the same? It was an unanswerable question, and yet it haunted every appeal, every expert report, every renewed request to test what remained in evidence. The legal system, cautious by design, responded with restraint. Courts acknowledged advancements, but emphasized standards. A conviction, they argued, is judged by the knowledge available at the time it was rendered, not by what comes after. To rule otherwise would destabilize the entire framework. Finality, once reached, must mean something. This logic was internally consistent, but emotionally hollow for those who believed the framework itself had failed. In academic circles, the case spurred deeper examination of how narratives form around forensic evidence. Studies were published exploring the halo effect of DNA, the tendency for jurors to elevate genetic evidence above all else, often subconsciously. Researchers cited the Florida case as an example where that effect may have shaped deliberations, compressing complex uncertainty into a single, persuasive conclusion. These findings circulated widely, yet rarely filtered back into the courtrooms where they might have mattered most. The victim's story continued to recede, eclipsed by debate over methods and meaning. Occasionally, an anniversary piece would attempt to recenter the narrative, describing the life interrupted, the plans never realize. But even these efforts felt incomplete, constrained by the lack of clarity surrounding the death itself. Without an agreed-upon explanation, remembrance remained abstract, unable to settle into a coherent account. In the community, fatigue set in. Years of discussion had yielded no consensus, only entrenched positions. Some residents avoided the topic entirely, tired of the unease it stirred. Others leaned into it, convinced that unresolved tension was preferable to comfortable facades. Conversations became quieter, more private, conducted among those who shared similar doubts. Public forums moved on, leaving the case to simmer in the background. Then, quietly, a new development emerged, not from law enforcement, but from the scientific community. A private laboratory, known for its work on re-examining old forensic conclusions, published a paper outlining a revised approach to interpreting low-level DNA samples. The paper did not reference the Florida case by name, but the parallels were unmistakable. Under the new framework, evidence once considered strongly indicative could, in certain contexts, be deemed inconclusive. The distinction was technical, but the implications were enormous. Advocates seized on the research, submitting it as part of yet another appeal. They argued that the science underpinning the conviction had fundamentally shifted, not in philosophy, but in practice. What had been persuasive was now questionable. The request was modest, allow retesting, allow re-evaluation, allow the possibility that understanding had evolved. The response, once again, was procedural delay. Behind the resistance lay a deeper fear, rarely articulated. Retesting could confirm the conviction, or it could unravel it. Either outcome carried risk. Confirmation might expose flaws in earlier interpretations without changing the result, raising questions about competence. Reversal would force acknowledgement of error on a scale institutions are ill-equipped to confront. The safest path, from an administrative perspective, was inaction. In prison correspondence, the convicted individual wrote about time differently now. Earlier letters had focused on innocence, on facts, on arguments. Later ones spoke of memory, of how the past becomes elastic when examined too often. They described the crime as something both intimate and distant, a fixed point around which their life now orbited without ever touching. Whether these reflections were expressions of truth or strategy was impossible to know. They were human, and that alone complicated them. Meanwhile, younger generations encountered the case through curated narratives, podcasts, documentaries, discussion threads. Many approached it without the emotional investment of those who had lived through the original shock. Their skepticism was analytical rather than personal. They asked different questions. Why was motive never established? Why was the initial suspect pool so narrow? Why did the investigation stall so completely before DNA entered the picture? These questions, unburdened by loyalty to past conclusions, felt sharper. Some former investigators watched this renewed scrutiny with discomfort. To them, the case represented years of effort, of doing the best they could with limited tools. Criticism felt like an erasure of that reality. Others, however, welcomed the re-examination, acknowledging privately that mistakes were inevitable, that progress required reckoning. Their voices, though rarely public, hinted at a quiet divide within the system itself. The Florida 1998 case, once a local tragedy, had become a mirror reflecting broader anxieties about justice in the modern age. How much uncertainty is acceptable? When does confidence become complacency? Can a system designed to conclude adapt to a world where knowledge is always provisional? These were not questions with clear answers, and the case offered none. As the 25th year faded into the 26th, the file remained closed, the sentence unchanged. Yet nothing about the case felt settled. It lingered in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between law and science, between what was decided and what might still be discovered. A cold case declared solved, behaving in every way like one that never truly was. And so it continued, not with dramatic turns or revelations, but with accumulation. Each study, each article, each quiet conversation added weight, pressing down on a verdict that had been asked to carry too much. The past did not change. The facts did not rearrange themselves. But understanding did, slowly, unevenly, like a tide that never quite recedes. In that slow movement lay the real tension of the Florida 1998 case. Not the crime itself, but what came after. The long, uncomfortable realization that answers, once given, do not necessarily grow stronger with age. Sometimes, they erode, revealing the fragile ground beneath. And in that erosion, the case found its true form, not as a solved mystery, but as an enduring question, waiting for someone, someday, to risk asking it in a way that could no longer be ignored. What finally disturbed the stillness was not a court order, or a scientific breakthrough, but a leak. A set of internal emails, quietly released by an anonymous source, circulated among journalists before officials could respond. They were unremarkable at first glance, routine correspondence, scheduling notes, cautious language, but buried within them was something far more consequential, acknowledgement. Not of innocence. Not of error. But of concern. Senior figures discussing, in private, the fragility of the evidentiary foundation, the risk of reputational damage if the case were reopened, the strategic value of letting time do what arguments could not. The emails changed the tone overnight. Speculation hardened into suspicion. The question was no longer whether the case should be re-examined, but why it hadn't been already. Officials denied any intent to conceal information, framing the messages as hypothetical discussions taken out of context. But context was exactly what critics seized upon. The language revealed priorities, and truth, conspicuously, was not at the top of the list. Public trust, once fractured, deteriorated further. Editorials appeared in regional papers, careful but pointed, asking whether justice systems exist to find truth, or to protect themselves from embarrassment. The Florida 1998 case, long treated as an example of scientific triumph, was now being cited as a warning about institutional inertia. The story had turned inward, less about a crime and more about the machinery that processed it. Under mounting pressure, authorities agreed to a limited review, not a retrial, not a reopening, but an assessment of procedural integrity. The phrase sounded reassuring and meant very little. It promised oversight without consequence, scrutiny without risk. Still, it was something. A crack in the wall that had held firm for years. The assessment unfolded quietly, its scope narrow by design. Reviewers examined documentation, not conclusions. They evaluated whether protocols had been followed, not whether they had been sufficient. Unsurprisingly, the findings were mixed. No clear violations. No smoking gun. But plenty of qualifiers. Language softened by bureaucratic caution. Decisions described as reasonable within contemporaneous standards, even as those standards were acknowledged to be outdated. It was a report that satisfied administrators and frustrated everyone else. Yet even this limited acknowledgement had ripple effects. Advocacy groups intensified their efforts. Lawmakers received letters. Public forums filled with renewed debate. The case, once again, refused to stay buried. Each attempt to contain it only seemed to give it more oxygen. In prison, the convicted individual learned of the emails through second-hand accounts, filtered and distorted by the pace of rumor. They reacted not with triumph, but with weariness. Another development. Another moment of attention. Another reminder that their life was tethered to forces far beyond their control. They continued to insist on innocence, but now with a different tone, not defiant, but resigned, as if the truth, whatever it was, had become less important than the process grinding endlessly around it. The victim's family responded to the leak with anger and confusion. Some felt betrayed, believing the system had toyed with their pain for the sake of image. Others doubled down, interpreting the scrutiny as an attack on the only resolution they had been given. Their unity fractured under the strain, each member navigating grief in their own way, each forced to confront the possibility that certainty might have been a gift built on unstable ground. As the debate intensified, a forgotten detail resurfaced, pulled from the margins of the original case file by a journalist with patience and time. A handwritten note from an early investigator, referencing an anonymous tip that had never been followed up. The tip described behavior consistent with guilt, tied to a person whose name did not appear anywhere in the trial record. At the time, it had been dismissed as unreliable, lacking corroboration. Now, decades later, its existence alone raised uncomfortable questions. Why had it been dismissed so quickly? Why had it not been documented more thoroughly? Authorities responded predictably. The tip, they said, had been evaluated and found wanting. No records remained beyond the note. Memory, they argued, was unreliable. The past could not be reconstructed indefinitely. But for critics, this explanation felt hollow. It reinforced the perception that the investigation had narrowed prematurely, locking onto a single path and discarding others without sufficient justification. The Florida 1998 case now lived in a space no verdict could control. It had become a symbol of contested truth, invoked in broader conversations about reform and accountability. Law schools hosted debates. Advocacy organizations cited it in campaigns. It was no longer just a case. It was a reference point, shorthand for a particular kind of unease that modern justice systems struggle to address. Amid all this, the original crime remained stubbornly opaque. No new witnesses emerged. No confessions surfaced. No physical evidence tied the violence to a clear motive or narrative. The more the aftermath was examined, the more distant the event itself seemed, as if the system's response had overshadowed the act it was meant to explain. The murder had become secondary to its interpretation. In quiet moments, some former investigators admitted a truth they rarely voiced publicly. The case had never felt complete. Even in its earliest days, there had been a sense that something was missing, that the scene had told only part of the story. That feeling had been pushed aside as years passed, replaced by urgency, then by relief when DNA offered a path forward. But relief, they now recognized, had come at a cost. The tension between science and certainty grew sharper. DNA, once treated as an endpoint, was increasingly understood as a tool that required context, humility, and restraint. Experts emphasized that genetic material can outlast intention, can travel without consent, can implicate without explaining. These ideas were not revolutionary, but they were gaining traction, reshaping how old cases were viewed through modern eyes. As the narrative fractured into competing interpretations, one thing remained constant: the absence of a story that satisfied all the facts. The prosecution's version explained the DNA, but not the motive. Alternative theories offered motives, but lacked physical proof. Each account illuminated one corner of the case while leaving others in shadow. No single explanation could withstand full exposure. And so the Florida 1998 case continued its uneasy existence, suspended between institutional confidence and public doubt. Officially resolved. Practically contested. Emotionally raw. It lingered not because of what was known, but because of what was missing. The gaps. The silences. The decisions made and unmade along the way. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of the case was not the possibility of error, but the realization that error, if it existed, might never be conclusively proven. That truth, once bent by time and procedure, does not always snap back into place. Sometimes it remains distorted, leaving everyone involved to navigate a landscape shaped as much by belief as by fact. And in that landscape, the Florida 1998 cold case persisted, not as a solved mystery, but as a living one. A reminder that justice is not a destination reached once and for all, but a process constantly tested by doubt, by memory, and by the courage, or reluctance, to look again when looking again feels most dangerous. Momentum, once regained, rarely moves in a straight line. It shifts, stalls, surges unexpectedly, carried less by facts than by perception. After the leak, after the limited review, after the resurfacing of long-ignored details, the Florida 1998 case entered a new phase, one defined not by official action, but by erosion. Confidence eroded. Narratives eroded. The clean edges of the original story wore down until what remained was uneven, unstable, and increasingly difficult to defend without qualification. Inside institutions, the response was defensive silence. Statements grew shorter. Language became more careful, more procedural. Requests for interviews were declined. When officials did speak, they emphasized fatigue, how long the case had already lasted, how much scrutiny it had endured, how impossible it was to satisfy everyone. The subtext was clear: at some point, questioning must stop. But the problem was that stopping no longer felt like an option. A new generation of legal scholars began writing about the case in a different way. Not as an argument about guilt or innocence, but as an example of narrative lock-in, the moment when an investigation becomes so committed to a particular explanation that alternative interpretations are unconsciously excluded. They pointed to the DNA hit as that moment, the instant when uncertainty collapsed into direction and direction hardened into conclusion. From there, everything else had been filtered through confirmation rather than exploration. These analyses found an audience far beyond academia. Podcasts dissected them. Comment sections filled with heated debate. For many listeners, this framing resonated more deeply than technical discussions of lab protocols. It explained a feeling they had struggled to articulate, that something had gone wrong not because of malice or incompetence, but because of momentum, because of the human desire for coherence in the face of chaos. The convicted individual became, unwillingly, a symbol within this debate. Their face, captured in old courtroom footage, circulated again, stripped of context, repurposed to represent broader questions about justice and doubt. To some, they were proof that the system works, that patience and science eventually deliver answers. To others, they were evidence of a system too eager to declare victory, too reluctant to revisit its own conclusions. The person themselves remained largely silent, advised by counsel, aware that every word could be twisted into confirmation of one narrative or another. In the community where the crime had occurred, the renewed attention felt invasive. Residents, who had rebuilt their lives around the assumption of resolution, now found themselves pulled back into uncertainty. Old rumors resurfaced, reshaped by time and imagination. Someone remembered a car differently. Someone else recalled a conversation that might have mattered. None of it was concrete. All of it contributed to the sense that the past was not as settled as it had seemed. A particularly unsettling question began to circulate quietly: what if the case had been solved, but incorrectly? Not that the wrong person had been accused deliberately, but that the right answer had been reached by the wrong reasoning. In legal terms, the distinction matters. In human terms, it is devastating. It suggests a justice system capable of arriving at truth by accident, unable to explain how it got there, and therefore unable to prove that it should be trusted. That question lingered as new information emerged from an unexpected source. A retired forensic analyst, no longer bound by institutional loyalty, spoke publicly about the pressure surrounding high-profile cold cases. They described environments where skepticism is subtly discouraged once a promising lead appears, where questioning the strength of evidence can be mistaken for obstruction rather than diligence. They did not name the Florida case explicitly, but their descriptions aligned too closely to ignore. The response was swift and dismissive. Officials criticized the analyst for speculation, for undermining public confidence, for speaking without access to all the facts. But the damage was done. The comments fit too neatly into an existing pattern, reinforcing suspicions that the case's weaknesses were not merely technical, but cultural. As these conversations unfolded, attention shifted back to the crime itself, almost out of desperation. People wanted to know what had actually happened in that house in 1998, stripped of legal outcomes and institutional defense. They revisited the scene as it had been described: no forced entry, no signs of struggle, no clear weapon. A crime that suggested familiarity, control, intention. These details had always been there, but they took on new significance when placed alongside a suspect with no clear connection to the victim. Why would a stranger commit such a crime without leaving clearer traces? Why would there be no evidence of escalation, no witness accounts of conflict? The questions were old, but now they felt sharper, less willing to be dismissed as unfortunate coincidences. They hinted at a narrative that had never been fully explored, one involving someone known, someone trusted, someone who understood the rhythms of the victim's life. This line of thought unsettled those who had accepted the conviction. It suggested not just doubt about the accused, but the possibility that the real story remained hidden, buried beneath years of misdirected focus. The idea was frightening in its simplicity. While attention had been fixed on defending a verdict, the truth might have been quietly slipping further out of reach. Law enforcement officials rejected this framing outright. The investigation, they insisted, had been thorough. All reasonable avenues had been explored. But reasonable is a flexible word, shaped by time, context, and expectation. What had seemed reasonable in 1998, or even in the early 2000s, no longer aligned with contemporary understanding. The gap between then and now widened, and with it, the difficulty of reconciling past decisions with present standards. In the absence of decisive action, the case began to settle into a new identity. Not a solved cold case. Not an unsolved one. But a contested one. A category that exists uncomfortably between definitions, where outcomes are legally fixed, but intellectually unstable. It is a space where arguments never quite end, where evidence is never fully retired, where every new development reopens old wounds rather than closing them. The Florida 1998 case occupied that space completely. It was invoked whenever discussions turned to reform, to the limits of forensic certainty, to the dangers of narrative momentum. It had outgrown its origins, becoming a reference point for anxieties far larger than itself. And yet, for all its symbolic weight, the core mystery remained stubbornly human. A person died. A life was taken. Someone, somewhere, knew why. That knowledge had either been lost, ignored, or misinterpreted. No amount of debate about process could substitute for that absence. As time pressed on, the possibility of definitive resolution grew thinner. Witnesses aged. Memories faded. Physical evidence degraded, no matter how carefully stored. Each year that passed without decisive re-evaluation made the truth harder to reach, not easier. The window for clarity narrowed, even as the demand for it intensified. In that narrowing space, the case took on a haunting quality. It was no longer about answers, but about the cost of not having them. The cost to a family forced to live with unresolved grief disguised as closure. The cost to an individual imprisoned under a verdict that refused to settle into unquestioned truth. The cost to a community asked to trust conclusions that no longer felt solid. The Florida 1998 cold case, declared solved, continued to unsettle precisely because it exposed something rarely acknowledged. That justice, once delivered, is expected to be immutable. But when the ground beneath it shifts, when new understanding collides with old decisions, immutability becomes a liability rather than a strength. And so the case endured, not moving forward, not receding into history, but hovering. A story without a stable ending. A question without a final answer. A reminder that some truths do not reveal themselves all at once, and that sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are not those left officially unsolved, but those declared finished while doubt still breathes quietly beneath the surface. The longer the case hovered in that unstable space, the more it began to reshape the people orbiting it. Detectives who had once spoken with certainty now chose their words carefully, aware that every statement would be replayed, analyzed, questioned. Prosecutors who had built careers on convictions felt the subtle pressure of legacy, the fear that one fracture could spread, turning confidence into caution. Even journalists found themselves hesitating, caught between the responsibility to question and the risk of amplifying doubt without resolution. A turning point arrived not with an announcement, but with a filing, quiet, procedural, easy to miss. A motion requesting access to evidence for independent testing, submitted by a coalition of forensic experts rather than defense attorneys. It was an unusual move, framed not as advocacy, but as inquiry. The experts argued that the case had outgrown adversarial boundaries, that its implications extended beyond guilt or innocence to the integrity of forensic interpretation itself. They were not asking to overturn a verdict. They were asking to understand it. The request unsettled officials more than any previous appeal. It came stripped of rhetoric, devoid of emotional language, grounded in peer-reviewed research and professional credibility. Denying it would require justification that went beyond finality. Granting it would open doors long held shut. For weeks, there was no response. Silence, once again, became the loudest answer. During that silence, attention returned to the crime scene, reconstructed through old photographs and reports. Analysts noted details that had been overshadowed for years. The lack of forced entry suggested consent or familiarity. The absence of a struggle implied either surprise or trust. These were not new observations, but they had never been reconciled with the profile of the convicted individual, whose connection to the victim remained tenuous even now. The contradiction lingered, unresolved, like a note that never quite fit the chord. In parallel, a former neighbor agreed to speak on record for the first time. They described a pattern of activity around the house in the weeks before the crime: frequent visitors, late-night conversations, arguments muffled by distance. At the time, it had seemed unremarkable. In retrospect, it felt different. The neighbor emphasized uncertainty, careful not to claim more than memory allowed, but their account added texture to a narrative that had long been flattened by focus on DNA alone. Authorities dismissed the testimony as too vague, too delayed to carry weight. But critics argued that delay was the point. In 1998, the investigation had been overwhelmed by immediacy, by the need to act quickly. Now, distance allowed patterns to emerge that urgency had obscured. Time, they suggested, can clarify as much as it erases. As pressure mounted, the court issued a response to the expert's motion. Partial approval. Access granted under strict conditions, limited scope, supervised handling. It was a compromise designed to appear transparent, without surrendering control. Still, it marked a shift. For the first time in years, the evidence would be examined outside the narrative that had defined it. The testing process unfolded slowly, deliberately, shielded from public view. Samples were reanalyzed using methods unavailable at the time of the original trial, capable of distinguishing between primary and secondary transfer, of modeling alternative scenarios rather than collapsing them into a single conclusion. The experts worked cautiously, aware that any result, confirming or complicating the conviction, would carry enormous weight. When preliminary findings emerged, they were neither explosive nor exonerating. They were, instead, unsettling in their subtlety. The DNA profile, once presented as singular and definitive, appeared more complex than previously acknowledged. Mixture interpretation suggested the possibility of additional contributors, not clearly identifiable, not easily dismissed. The results did not contradict the original match. They reframed it. This reframing ignited debate immediately. Supporters of the conviction emphasized consistency. The convicted individual's DNA was still present. Critics focused on ambiguity, presence without clarity, implication without explanation. The space between those positions widened, fueled by differing interpretations of what science can and cannot say. Officials responded with restraint, cautioning against overreading preliminary data. The conviction, they reiterated, remained valid. The new findings, they argued, did not undermine the core conclusion. But the language had changed. Certainty gave way to confidence. Confidence to assurance. Each step down the ladder of conviction was small, but noticeable. The victim's family reacted with a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. Some questioned why the case could not simply be left alone. Others wondered, quietly, whether knowing more, even if it complicated everything, was preferable to clinging to an answer that felt increasingly fragile. Grief, after so many years, had learned to coexist with ambiguity. Closure, once promised, now seemed conditional. The convicted individual received the news through legal channels, the language dense, cautious, stripped of drama. To them, the findings represented neither victory nor defeat, but continuation. Another chapter in a story that refused to end. They responded publicly only through a statement expressing hope that the truth, whatever it was, would eventually emerge. It was a measured response, one that avoided claims, perhaps aware that certainty had become suspect on all sides. As the case absorbed these developments, its role as a symbol deepened. It was no longer just about forensic evidence or judicial outcomes. It had become a study in how systems handle doubt. Whether they absorb it, deflect it, or allow it to reshape conclusions. The Florida 1998 case sat at the center of that study, an uncomfortable example that resisted neat categorization. Public interest surged again, but with a different tone. Less outrage. More contemplation. Discussions shifted from blame to process, from verdicts to vulnerability. How many other cases, people wondered, rested on similarly narrow foundations? How often had certainty been declared simply because uncertainty was too difficult to manage? In the background, the crime itself remained unchanged. A life ended violently. A moment frozen in time. No new explanation had emerged to replace the old one. The gap between evidence and narrative persisted, stubborn and unfilled. Each new analysis illuminated the gap rather than closing it. As the experts prepared their final report, anticipation mixed with apprehension. Whatever they concluded would not deliver absolution or condemnation in simple terms. It would add complexity to an already tangled story. It would force choices, whether to revisit, to revise, or to resist. And beneath all of it lay the question that had never been answered, only deferred. Not whether the system could justify its decision, but whether justification was enough. Whether a story held together by procedure and precedent could stand when its emotional and logical foundations had eroded. The Florida 1998 cold case stood at that threshold, balanced between reaffirmation and reconsideration. Declared solved, yet still unfolding. A reminder that time does not always move cases toward clarity. Sometimes, it pulls them apart, revealing the fragile threads that once seemed strong enough to carry the weight of truth. The final report arrived without spectacle, bound in neutral language, its conclusions careful, conditional, resistant to headlines. It did not proclaim innocence. It did not dismantle the conviction. Instead, it did something more destabilizing. It introduced uncertainty where certainty had once been assumed, and it did so with authority that could not be easily dismissed. The experts concluded that the DNA evidence, while correctly identified, had been overstated in its narrative power. Presence did not equal action. Transfer could not be conclusively timed. Context had been inferred, not demonstrated. The profile linked a person to an environment, not to a moment, not to intent. The report emphasized that the science had evolved faster than the story built around it, leaving behind a verdict that now rested on interpretive ground far less solid than originally believed. The response was immediate and fragmented. Law enforcement acknowledged the findings, but rejected their implications. Prosecutors highlighted corroborating circumstantial evidence, even as critics noted how thin that evidence appeared once stripped of DNA's assumed certainty. Courts faced an uncomfortable reality. The report did not meet the threshold for overturning a conviction, yet ignoring it entirely risked appearing willfully blind. The case entered a procedural limbo. Motions were filed. Hearings were scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. Each delay stretched the tension, prolonging a reckoning no one seemed eager to complete. The language of the courtroom grew dense with qualifiers, every argument hedged against the possibility of future scrutiny. It was no longer about winning. It was about surviving what came next. Outside the courtroom, the public conversation sharpened again. This time, it was not fueled by speculation, but by fatigue. People questioned why clarity felt so elusive, why the system seemed capable only of partial answers. The phrase, reasonable doubt, circulated widely, its meaning debated, stretched, redefined. Reasonable to whom? Doubt about what? The case forced these questions into the open, exposing how fragile consensus becomes when certainty erodes. For the victim's family, the report reopened wounds they had spent decades trying to seal. Some felt betrayed by the suggestion that the resolution they had been given might have been incomplete. Others clung to the conviction as the only barrier between grief and chaos. They were asked, implicitly, to choose between peace and truth, a choice no one should have to make. The convicted individual remained at the center of this storm, largely voiceless, their identity overshadowed by arguments they could not control. Years behind bars had reduced life to routine, but the renewed attention disrupted even that. Hope became dangerous again, something to be managed rather than embraced. The possibility of reconsideration existed, but it was fragile, dependent on institutions that had already invested heavily in finality. As hearings resumed, the focus shifted from evidence to philosophy. Judges questioned whether evolving science should retroactively unsettle settled cases. Attorneys argued about standards, about precedent, about the balance between justice and stability. The courtroom became a forum not just for this case, but for the future of forensic reliance itself. No single moment delivered resolution. Instead, the case seemed to thin out, stretched across motions and counter-motions, its urgency diluted by process. Yet beneath that procedural calm, the implications simmered. If this conviction could be questioned without being overturned, how many others existed in the same space? How many stories had been closed not because they were complete, but because they were convenient? The Florida 1998 case no longer belonged solely to those directly involved. It had become a mirror, reflecting the limits of certainty, the cost of confidence, the danger of mistaking scientific possibility for narrative truth. It showed how easily a system can move from inquiry to conclusion, and how difficult it is to reverse that movement once momentum takes hold. As the court recessed once more, no ruling issued, no decision announced, the sense of suspension deepened. The case was not advancing toward an ending. It was circling, revisiting the same questions from slightly altered angles, never quite landing. Time, once the enemy of cold cases, now seemed to protect the status quo, wearing down urgency through repetition. And still, the original moment remained untouched. The silence of that house in 1998. The absence of explanation. The irreversible fact of a life ended. All the debate, all the analysis, all the procedure orbited that moment without penetrating it. The truth, whatever it was, remained intact, unclaimed, resistant to interpretation. The Florida 1998 cold case had reached a strange maturity. It no longer promised revelation. It offered something darker, more unsettling, the realization that some cases do not resolve cleanly, that some answers arrive fractured, and that justice, once declared, can continue to unravel long after the gavel falls. The story pressed on, not toward closure, but toward endurance. A case solved on paper, questioned in practice, and haunted by the possibility that certainty itself had been the greatest illusion of all. By the time the case reached its final public reckoning, it no longer felt like a single story. It felt like sediment, layers of certainty and doubt compressed over decades, each one reshaped by pressure, each one altering what lay beneath it. What remained visible on the surface was not resolution, but endurance, the quiet, unsettling fact that the case had survived every attempt to finish it. The court's last decision arrived without cameras, without crowds, without the language of triumph or defeat. The conviction would stand. The report would be entered into record. No retrial. No reversal. No declaration of error. The ruling acknowledged uncertainty, without allowing it to change the outcome. It was, in legal terms, precise. In human terms, it was dissonant. Officials framed the decision as balance. Respect for science, respect for finality. Respect for victims, respect for institutions. The words sounded measured, reasonable, complete. But for many, they landed hollow. The ruling did not answer the questions that had grown louder with each year. It simply marked the point at which the system chose to stop listening to them. Public reaction was muted, not because people didn't care, but because outrage had given way to something heavier. Acceptance, not of the truth, but of limitation. The realization that the system could acknowledge uncertainty and still move forward unchanged forced a recalibration of expectation. Justice, it seemed, was not designed to be perfect. It was designed to be stable. The Florida 1998 cold case settled into its final form there, not as a solved mystery, not as an open wound, but as a scar. Something healed just enough to function, but never enough to forget. It would no longer dominate headlines. It would be referenced, cited, debated in classrooms and conferences. Its emotional weight would fade from public consciousness, even as its implications lingered. For the victim's family, the decision brought a strange quiet. Not peace, not closure, but the end of waiting. Some chose to speak, others withdrew completely. Grief had long since reshaped itself around the verdict, and now it reshaped itself again around doubt. They learned to live with a truth that might never be fully theirs to know. For the convicted individual, the ruling confirmed what years had already suggested. That the system's acknowledgement of complexity did not extend to mercy. That doubt could exist indefinitely without consequence. Life returned to routine, but the possibility of innocence, or of being wronged, remained unresolved, suspended in a space where it could neither be proven nor erased. The community moved on, as communities always do. New residents arrived unaware of the history beneath their feet. Houses changed hands. Streets were renamed. The physical traces of the crime disappeared, replaced by the ordinary markers of time. Only memory preserved the weight of what had happened, and memory, too, thinned with each passing year. Yet the case refused to vanish entirely. It resurfaced whenever discussions turned to forensic certainty, to wrongful convictions, to the psychology of closure. It became shorthand for a particular discomfort, the idea that answers can be declared before they are fully understood, and that once declared, they resist revision no matter how much the ground beneath them shifts. The Florida 1998 cold case taught no simple lesson. It offered no clear villain, no dramatic reversal, no moment of revelation that reassembled the past into coherence. Instead, it revealed something more unsettling. That truth is not always the endpoint of investigation. That sometimes, the endpoint is consensus. And that consensus can exist independently of certainty. In the end, the most haunting aspect of the case was not what was known, but what remained unreachable. The precise sequence of moments inside that house. The motive that never surfaced. The human decision that turned an ordinary day into a permanent absence. All of it remained locked in a past that could be revisited endlessly without ever being entered. Time continued its work, indifferent to doubt or verdict. Evidence aged. Records yellowed. Those who had been young during the investigation grew old. Those who had been old disappeared entirely. The case, once urgent, became archival, its emotional charge dissipating into analysis and reference. And yet, for those who looked closely, it still whispered. About the danger of certainty. About the cost of momentum. About the quiet ways systems protect their conclusions long after their foundations have weakened. It reminded anyone willing to listen that a case can be declared closed while its truth remains open, unresolved, and profoundly human. The Florida 1998 cold case ended not with an answer, but with a realization that some stories do not conclude. They persist. They echo. They linger in the spaces between what is proven and what is believed. And long after the files are shelved and the headlines fade, they continue to ask the same question, softly but relentlessly: what if the truth is still out there, waiting, untouched by the certainty that once claimed it? Years later, long after the final ruling had been filed away, and the last official statement archived, the case continued to live a quieter life, one that unfolded outside courtrooms and headlines. It existed in fragments, in conversations between law students late at night, in the cautious language of forensic textbooks, in the uneasy pauses of investigators asked what they would do differently now. The Florida 1998 cold case had become something that could not be concluded, only carried. Those who revisited it did so with restraint. Not because the story had lost its power, but because its power had changed. It no longer shocked. It unsettled. It forced anyone who examined it to confront a fundamental discomfort: that certainty, once institutionalized, becomes heavier than truth. That systems designed to discover facts can become invested in preserving conclusions. And that time, instead of clarifying, can harden assumptions until they are mistaken for inevitability. In interviews conducted years later, former officials spoke with a tone that bordered on introspection. Some acknowledged moments they wished they had slowed down, questions they wished they had pressed harder, doubts they had felt, but set aside in favor of progress. None admitted error outright. But regret has a way of leaking through careful phrasing, revealing itself in what is not said as much as what is. The forensic community continued to debate the case in technical terms. Mixture interpretation. Transfer probability. Contextual bias. The language was precise, clinical, stripped of emotion. Yet beneath that precision lay an unspoken awareness that science, powerful as it is, does not operate in isolation. It is interpreted by people, filtered through expectation, shaped by narrative. The Florida case became a cautionary example not of bad science, but of science asked to do more than it reasonably could. For the broader public, memory of the case faded unevenly. Some remembered it as a triumph of DNA technology, a long-delayed answer finally delivered. Others remembered it as something unresolved, a story that never sat quite right. Both memories coexisted, incompatible yet equally persistent. The truth, if it existed cleanly at all, was buried somewhere between them. Occasionally, a new article or documentary would resurface the case, framing it for a new audience. Each retelling emphasized different details, highlighted different uncertainties. None could escape the same gravity. The absence at the center of the story pulled every narrative inward, bending it toward the same unresolved core. No amount of distance softened that pull. The house where it happened no longer bore any sign of what had occurred. Renovated, repainted, re-inhabited, it blended into its surroundings like any other structure shaped by time. And yet, for those who knew the story, the space retained a kind of weight. Not supernatural. Psychological. The knowledge that something irreversible had unfolded there, leaving behind no explanation strong enough to endure unquestioned. The convicted individual aged quietly within the system. Appeals dwindled. Legal options narrowed. Life continued in measured increments, days defined less by hope than by endurance. The case that had defined their existence became an abstraction to others, but to them it remained immediate, pressing, unresolved. The question of what really happened never lost its edge. It simply learned to coexist with routine. The victim's name, once spoken constantly, gradually receded from public conversation. Not out of disrespect, but out of exhaustion. Yet the loss itself never diminished. It remained absolute, immune to debate or reinterpretation. No report, no ruling, no analysis altered the fact of absence. That absence was the one certainty the case had never lacked. Over time, the Florida 1998 cold case came to represent a particular kind of ending. Not the dramatic closure promised by headlines, not the silence of forgotten files, but something in between. An ending that refuses to resolve into clarity, that lingers as an open question wrapped in official language. A reminder that being solved and being understood are not the same thing. Those who study cases like this learn to recognize that feeling. The sense that an investigation has reached its legal conclusion, while its moral and factual dimensions remain unfinished. It is an uncomfortable recognition, one that resists easy acceptance. It demands humility from institutions and patience from the public, both of which are in short supply when certainty feels safer than doubt. And so the case persists, not as an active investigation, but as a presence. It lives in footnotes and lectures, in cautious reforms and quiet acknowledgements that the past cannot always be corrected, only examined. It challenges anyone who encounters it to ask not just whether the system worked, but what working truly means. In the end, the Florida 1998 cold case leaves behind no definitive answer, only an enduring tension. Between science and story. Between justice and finality. Between what can be proven and what can be known. It stands as a testament to the limits of resolution, and to the unsettling truth that some mysteries do not fade, because they are unsolved, but because they were solved too quickly. The files remain closed. The questions remain open. And somewhere, in the quiet space between those two facts, the truth waits, unchanged by verdicts, untouched by time, and still just out of reach.